Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Scrutiny panel meeting. I'm Councillor Mary Vallely, Chair of the panel. I'd like to draw your attention to the following. Safety information for housekeeping. If the continuous fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the room and the public gallery by the stairwells. Do not attempt to use the lifts. Please assemble on Queen Victoria's statue in front of the civic offices. And in order to comply with fire marshal's regulations, if you signed into the Guildhall, please remember to sign out when you leave the building after today's meeting. So we're live web streaming today. I need to draw your attention to the fact that this meeting will be live streamed from a camera at a fixed location at the back of the meeting room. And the recording will be on the Council's website. The camera will mainly capture the backs of anyone making deputations, back of their head, probably, and but there'll be some footage of them as they approach and leave the table where the microphones are located, and of people entering or leaving the room whilst the meeting is in progress. Members of the public are also permitted to record the meeting on the understanding that it neither disrupts the meeting nor records those stating explicitly that they do not want to be recorded. May I ask everyone to use the microphones provided when they're speaking? And please, can I ask members and officers to introduce themselves, starting with yourself?
Thank you, Chair. I'm James Harris, and I'm the Senior Local Democracy Officer.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Chris Ward, the Director of Finance and Resources.
Councillor Graham Heaney, Deputy Leader of the Labour Group.
Councillor Raymond Dent, Cotton Ward. Councillor Abdul Kadir, Baffins Ward.
Richard Adair, Councillor for Nelson Ward, standing in for Gerald Vernon Jackson.
And at the back.
I'm Councillor Lee Hunt, a member of the Cabinet and observing.
Thank you. Anybody got any declarations of interest to declare today? No, thank you very much. So the minutes of the meeting held on the 2nd of September 2024 and the 11th of November 2024. Are members happy with the minutes of the meeting? Have you got them in front of you? Have you had a little chance to read them? Is this a correct record? First of all, of the 2nd of September, those of you that were there. Nobody was here on the 2nd of September. I was. So I'll say yes, thank you, Councillor. And the 11th of November, please.
Yep.
Yeah. Great.
Do we have any apologies?
Oh, haven't got there yet.
Oh, sorry. you're moving the agenda around.
So members are happy with the... You're right, we've missed out apology. Have we got any apologies? Did I go through them? Oh, yes, we have. So Councillor Ian Holder has given us apologies. Councillor Vernon Jackson. Councillor Adair sitting in. Thank you very much. And that's it, I think. Yeah, okay. So today, folks, we have the budget and council tax for 25-26, the medium-term budget forecast for 26-27 and 28-29, and the capital strategy 25-26 to 34-35. So Chris Ward is our officer to deliver a presentation. Oh, hi, Councillor. That's okay. Anything to declare? Lovely. Chris, I'm handing over to you. I'm going to go down there and sit to watch, if that's okay with you.
Thank you, Chair. Before we start, there are some handouts available. Some of you may pick them up, but others maybe not. Councillor Hockaday, I don't know whether you've... Okay, I'll just wait a couple of seconds whilst you... I think they're... James, are they up by the entrance? That's okay. Okay. So, just to start with, then obviously this is the council's or the cabinet's proposal for the budget for 25-26 and the capital programme for 24-25 through to 28-29. This will be considered by the cabinet tomorrow afternoon. So this is your opportunity, obviously, to listen and, if you are minded to make any recommendations to the cabinet for their consideration tomorrow. The following cabinet tomorrow, they will then make their endorsement of the proposal, and they will forward that to full council for your meeting on the 25th of February. So just to start with, what I thought I'd do is try to give you a picture of what the whole story of the budget is on a single page. So the headlines really at a glance, and I'm going to major in the main actually on 25-26 rather than the current year, which obviously you will see through our quarterly budget monitoring reports that go through cabinet. I'll make references to 24-25 as it pertains to 25-26, but the majority of this presentation is about the budget for 25-26, the council tax for 25-26, capital programme for any new capital investment for starting next year, and also what the council's future forecast looks like. So if we start with what does 25-26 mean in terms of spending, so how much more is the budget for 25-26 than it is in the current year. So spending is up by £18.8 million, which is actually quite significant on a £220 million net budget. It equates to about 8.5%, so it's an 8.5% increase, and the main areas where spending is increasing is in social care and in housing. When I say social care, I'm talking about both adults and children's social care, so I'll break into those as we go into the presentation proper. But an additional £17.5 million to be spent on adults and children's social care next year. Much of that, as you'll come to hear me say, is based on the experience of the current year and the overspendings that are being experienced in those areas in the current year that will have an ongoing impact. Temporary accommodation, I've mentioned, you probably heard throughout the year that we're overspending on temporary accommodation. In the current year, it's about 5.9 million. That will have an ongoing impact, but there are plans within this overall budget proposal to seek to remedy the pressure that is being experienced around temporary accommodation, and I'll come on to that. Inflation on all other services, so there's pay award, prices are rising generally with inflation, that amounts to 3.4 million, so that puts, if you like, the proposal for next year for council services in the steady state. So it's about providing council services next year akin to those that are provided this year, but uprated for next year's prices. And there is a saving in next year's budget, which has been welcome, actually, because the next year's budget has been a challenge, as you'll come to hear. There's a saving in terms of what we describe as our treasury investment. So this is the cash that we have on a temporary basis, surplus, that we invest on the money markets. That's not invested in any way that is risky. And the council receive a treasury management strategy each year in March that describes how those treasury investments are made, in effect, in the main, to AAA institutions. So there's a lot of security that sits behind it. It's just a way of making the best of temporary cash balances that sit in the bank account, pending their use. So as I said, spending is up 18.8 million, or 8.5%. Funding is actually up slightly more than that. So funding is increased by 19.2 million. Now our funding comes from three main sources. The largest, actually, I'll take these out of order. The largest funding source we have is council tax. That represents, as you'll come to hear me say later, almost half now of the council's funding. So it's a really important funding source for the council now, and therefore the extent to which it increases is really important to the council as well. Government funding is increased by 14.3 million, and I'll talk about the settlement later. It's a different figure for the settlement because, unfortunately, when you hear the stories about the local government finance settlement, that's not everything. It's a subset of the funding that the council receive from government. A large subset, but it's not all of it. And business rates. It looks like business rates income next year is actually down, but that masks, which I'll come to explain, an underlying increase in business rates of about 1.7 million. But I'll explain that as we go through why it's down, but that will become clear later. Within the spending, actually, that I mentioned earlier of 18.8 million, there are savings proposals of £2 million. So without those savings of 2 million, the spending would have been 20.8 million, and it's not, it's 18.8 because of the savings proposals that are put forward by the Cabinet. And just to finish off on the revenue budget, it's important to recognise, I think, that going into 25-26, whilst I'll be saying to you that the council has a balanced budget, it does, but there is an underlying deficit in that budget of £4.4 million. What that means is that if you look at your recurring spending, so no one-off items, take all the one-off items out. If you look at your recurring spending and your recurring funding, and again, take any one-off items of funding or income out, then what you end up is a gap between your recurring spending and your recurring funding, or your underlying position, of £4.4 million. I'll come to talk about the overall strategy that we have, which our overall strategy seeks to keep those things in balance, at least in the medium term. That's how you get sustainability. Within the budget report, you will see that there are proposals for an increase in council tax of 4.99%. 2% of that is for adult social care, and the funding raised from that 2% goes directly to funding adult social care. Moving away from the revenue budget and funding and into the capital programme, there's £53.4 million worth of capital investment. A big chunk of that relates to temporary accommodation. So over 30 million of that relates to temporary accommodation. Come to that, it's a good proposition in financial terms, but I'll spend more time on talking about that later. And then if we start to look to the future, and back to our revenue budget now, if we start to look to the future and we ask ourselves, what do we think our financial position will look like, not next year, but 3 years hence, so in 28-29, so that we're planning on a medium-term basis. Our forecast looks like we'll have a £9 million deficit. So what that means is, in order for us to get into balance, we need to be spending £9 million less in 28-29 than we will be in next financial year. And that £9 million less can come from a combination of either reduced spending, i.e. savings, or it could come from increased income, or it could come from additional funding. When I say funding, I mean council tax, business rates and government funding. It could come from additional funding as well. So it could be a combination of all of those things in order to try and bridge that £9 million gap. And that translates into, in terms of the journey to get there, or the strategy to get to 9 million, the proposal is to do that on an even basis, so £3 million in each of the years. So £3 million in year one, so that's not next year, it's the year 26-27, the year after, a further 3 million the year after that, and then a further 3 million the year after that. That takes you to the 9 million. And along that journey, by the time, if you followed that pathway, by the time you get to 26-27, you will have achieved that ideal of structural balance. So by the time you get to 27-28 and 28-29, you're making the savings required in the year to achieve structural balance each year. So that, in summary, that's the proposals that are contained within the budget proposal. So let me just take you through the budget in a little bit more detail. Not too much, but a little bit more. So first of all, a little bit of the context and where we've come from. So we state this every year because I think it is important to understand where you've come from. It's important when we talk about the savings or the proposed savings that are put forward, to get a sense of how difficult that is, you need to understand the level of savings you've made in the past. Because if you've made a lot of savings in the past, obviously every incremental saving you make beyond that becomes more and more difficult. We usually use the base year of 2011-12 because obviously that was just about the period when austerity came. Now, it's not fair to say that funding levels have been reducing in recent years, because they haven't. They have been increasing. They just haven't been increasing at the pace that our costs have been increasing. So it does cause a structural imbalance within the local government finance system. So in recent years, it's more about funding is increasing, but nowhere near at the level that our costs are increasing, particularly around social care. In years past, funding was reducing. So that's meant that the council has had to make, including the £2 million worth of proposed savings this year, £110 million worth of savings over the period 2011-12 to this, and up to and including 25-26. That's about, if we went back to 2011-12, that's about 50% of our controllable spending at that point. So it's not insignificant, it's actually very substantial. Another piece of important context is that social care, adults and children's social care, consume around about 60% of all of our spending. So you start to get a sense now that if you are trying to make savings, you're coming from a backdrop of high levels of savings in the past, and 60% of your spending is consumed by adults and children's social care, the areas where it's most difficult to find savings. It actually means that if you don't want to cause a hugely disproportionate impact on the rest of the council services, that those services also have to be part of the solution to make savings. Otherwise, you will be putting a line through many other services outside of those areas, and probably including statutory services as well, that are outside the statutory services of adults and children's. A bit more context around council tax. We actually, not only do we have a low tax base, and that means we've got lots of A's and B's in terms of banded tax bands, lots of council tax band A and council tax band B, which compared to other local authorities means that we will receive less in council tax, because obviously those council tax bands pay lower amounts of council tax. In addition to that, our actual level of council tax, so the price that you pay, not the band that you're in, but the level of your council tax, is also low. And compared to our statistical neighbours, so not compared to every local authority, or not compared to every unitary authority, but compared to our statistical near neighbours, we tax 9.1% lower than our statistical neighbours. That's historic, you know, that's from years gone by. But in what that means in terms of pounds, if we were to tax just at the average of our near neighbours, the council would receive an extra £10 million worth of council tax income, which obviously would be used to fund council services. So important to recognise that the council is already coming from a position where it taxes low, but that's not to diminish anyway the fact that council tax is obviously a large part of a household's income's costs, but just compared to our statistical neighbours, we tax low. But all of that in combination means that the amount of council tax that the council receives is relatively low compared to our statistical neighbours. And as I've said, the drivers for this budget, the whole thing is framed really around adult social care, children's social care and temporary accommodation. They are the things that are the driving challenges going forward. So I alluded earlier on, I talked a little bit about structural balance earlier on, which obviously is the panacea. You have to get there anyway, otherwise, because you can't run a deficit indefinitely. If you run a deficit indefinitely, you're bankrupt. You end up applying to government for exceptional financial support, or you might, in a worst case scenario, end up with a Section 114 notice. So budgeting for a deficit on an annual basis is not sustainable. So our strategy, overall aim, is obviously that we want to get to a position in the medium term where our in-year expenditure matches our in-year income. That is structural balance, and we'd like to maintain that obviously over the period of our forecast. It's important that within any financial strategy, it's not just about balancing the books. It's also intended to give an indication of where the focus of the council's activity ought to be, and that is in our strategy around regeneration, because it increases prosperity in the main. If you increase prosperity in the city, not only is it good for your residents, it can be good for the council because it means there's less demand for council services and you can reduce your costs much more easily. But there's also importance around being innovative, creative, protecting the most important valued services and providing value for money services for our residents. So that's the context and the strategy. If we just, I'll just talk a little bit about the revised budget. I know I said that the focus of this is on 25-26, but it's quite important to understand what's happening in the current year because that is what is dominating what the proposal for 25-26. So those of you that will have been following the budget position through cabinet reporting each quarter will know that there's significant challenges around adult social care, children's social care, temporary accommodation. Combined, those three areas are overspending by over £16 million. That is enormous, some of which there was some anticipation for, and it's why the council has a corporate contingency, to manage potential overspendings that are unknown at the time the budget was set, but could happen. That could be changes in the demand, i.e. we could have additional children in care. It might be the cost of those placements is higher than we had anticipated. Could be that we've got additional adults in residential nursing care, which is what we're experiencing, or it could be the cost of their packages of care is increasing because complexity is increasing. We know from our experience what is happening in Portsmouth at the moment that obviously there's a flow through of adult social care, for example, and the clients that are joining and the clients that are leaving, if I can put it politely that way, those that are leaving with relatively lower cost care packages. Those that are joining with relatively high cost care packages. And that's a symptom of a living longer population. And you'll know what's happened around temporary accommodation with the huge increases that we've seen in homelessness and then accommodating those, having to accommodate those, either in bed and breakfast or for those with families in the private rented sector in the main, because you can only hold families in bed and breakfast for a maximum of 6 weeks. And the costs in particular of those of accommodating homelessness in the private rented sector is very significant. And as I've mentioned, you heard me talk about on the front slide in terms of the headlines going forward, that part of the reason the 25-26 budget has been helped is because of our treasury investments. We're experiencing that in the current year as well. What that has meant is that in order to put to council a revised budget, that accommodates, because obviously we've got an obligation to present to council a budget that balances and one that's robust. That has meant that we've had to increase the council's contingency to accommodate those forecast overspendings. So we already had money in the contingency, we've had to top it up in order to accommodate all of those overspendings that I've just mentioned. And there's a top up of 5.6 million, making our contingency just 22.6 million, I was going to say just over, but 22.6 million to accommodate all of the forecast overspendings in the current year and some potential unknown unknowns that may happen towards the end of the year. It has meant that we still obviously are presenting a balanced budget, and there is a contribution to general reserves of 0.6 million, so we're not having to draw on general reserves in order to balance that position up. So if I move into 25-26, you'll hear me talk about very similar themes, but the numbers are different because we're now moving on, and there's obviously inflation to contend with in 25-26, and any potential growth in volumes, whether it be client numbers, children in care, those in temporary accommodation. But before I get to that, obviously each year we do a budget consultation, so it's important that the budget proposal is also framed in the context of what residents tell the council is important to them. So the budget consultation ran across September, and there were 1,581 responses. Less than last year, but still, as consultations go, still a reasonable response. So we've broken this down. Whilst it was quite a lengthy consultation, but we've summarised it and broken it down into what we describe as service priorities, which you might interpret as your revenue budget priorities, and capital investment priorities, which you would interpret as your capital programme priorities. So in terms of the revenue budget, the top 3 responses were about feeling safe and supported, about creation of homes, jobs and economic opportunities, and the natural environment, having a healthy and resilient and natural environment. So they were the priorities in terms of the revenue budget. The priorities in terms of the capital programme, again, some of it was about healthy lifestyle, and in particular, actually, number 1 was about investing in leisure and sports facilities. Secondly was around transport and sustainable travel. Third, making the council more efficient, downsizing the civic offices, reducing our costs. And fourth, around additional homes, council homes. And 5, around open spaces and sea defences. The reason I put 5 priorities in the capital side is actually they were quite close together. So you'll see the spread there in terms of those that mention those within their priorities ranges only from 38% to 46%. So it felt a little bit unfair just to talk about the top 3 when they were so close together. Before we get onto the spending side, I thought I'd talk about the funding side. So first I'll talk about what's happened in terms of funding from government. So we received the provisional settlement on the 20th of December. Is it 20th or the 18th? Anyway, I can't remember. It's one of those 2 dates. But subsequent to that, we've now received the final settlement. The final settlement barely changed. It changed for us by, I think it was about 50,000. It was a small amount of money. But what we saw in the settlement was an overall increase in grant funding of 11.2 million. I'm going to start contrasting this to some of the costs in a second. So you've already heard me talk about £17.5 million in social care. So 11.2 million in overall grant funding. The social care grants, That's both adults and children's, increased by 5.2. There's a new recovery grant. Now, the new recovery grant is, you may have heard when in the autumn budget statement, the Chancellor spoke about an extra 1.3 billion into local government. Half of that, nearly 600 million, was to be provided through this thing called the recovery grant. And the intention of the recovery grant is to compensate, or I'll rephrase that in a second, is to increase funding to those local authorities that are relatively deprived and have relatively low ability to raise council tax. So if I've explained this before in terms of saying if you kind of ranked every local authority in terms of deprivation from 1 to 354, see where you are in the ranking. You do the same thing in terms of your council tax income, 1 to 354, see where you are in the ranking. If your ability to raise council tax is lower than your deprivation, then you'll receive some funding because you can't raise it yourself. And obviously Portsmouth was one of those councils. This grant was not available to every council. It was, I think it applied to about half of the councils in the country. And Portsmouth was a recipient of by 5.1 million. And it's welcome for us, obviously, because if that hadn't been received, the challenge of this year's budget would have been much greater. And so would the deficit. The deficit would have been £5 million more than the 9 million I mentioned at the start of the presentation. And a marginal amount of 0.9 million for all other grants. Business rate retention. This is obviously part of the funding. It's part of the local government funding system as well. And what you will have heard me at the top of the presentation say that we actually, our business rate income is down. It is down compared to last year, but there's a reason for that. But there's an underlying increase of 1.7 million. The reason it's down compared to last year is that we had a surplus in the previous year, unplanned. We call it a collection fund surplus because that's where all the money is collected into. So we had a surplus in the previous year, a very sizable one. It was about 5 million or over 5 million. And because of that, it looks as though it's not repeated. It looks as though our income is actually down. It is in absolute terms, but there's an underlying increase of 1.7 million, or about 2.5%. And that broadly reflects the fact that business rates increase each year with the consumer price index. So wherever the consumer price index is in September is how much business rates generally increase by. And that percentage uplift was 1.7%. So our uplift is 2.5%. So it's a little bit of growth as well as the inflationary uplift, or the price uplift, if you like. And the only other thing to mention as part of the settlement that was announced or that was finalised recently is it's also set the course for a complete reform of local government funding. That will be consulted on during this year and in place for next financial year, alongside a multi-year settlement, which is what local government have been asking for since I can remember. But obviously that settlement will be informed by the comprehensive spending review that is due to take place this spring. So there's a lot in the settlement, but there's a lot, in terms of what is in the settlement, there's a lot in the settlement that relates to future years because of the whole reform of the local government funding system. And the stated intention at this stage, because the first stage consultation is already out and closes Wednesday actually, and that's just on the principles, but a lot of the principles centre around should there be additional funding targeted towards deprivation and need. It's kind of an obvious answer to that. and should there be recognition of the ability of councils to be able to fund their own need through the levels of council tax that they raise? And there's another obvious answer to that question. There's a lot more in between, but there's that feels like the direction of travel. And important to note also that all of the data, so all of the information that we have, or that is collected that informs the way that funding works from government at the moment, is more than 10 years out of date. I'll just take a drink. So, in overall terms, an uplift in funding from government grants of 11.2, and whilst it's a reduction in funding for business rates, there's an underlying increase. Council tax, as I said, this is now a much more important source of funding for the council, representing nearly half of the funding that we receive. In terms of the settlement set the referendum thresholds, or AKA the cap, and those thresholds were set at 3% for general purposes and 2% for the adult social care precept. It's a £14, so it's an absolute increase, so it's a pounds increase for Police and Crime Commissioner of £14. In percentage terms, that's 5.35%. And again, for the Fire and Rescue Authority, it's a limit in terms of pounds. It's a £5 increase limit, and that equates to just over 6% in overall terms. So, come to it on the next slide. I'll put all that together in terms of what does that mean for a Portsmouth resident when they see that council tax bill land on the doorstep. And as I've said, the other point of the main part of the local government finance settlement was about the future of local government funding and funding reform. So, the council tax proposal, just in a bit more depth, partly because it's a key feature of the budget report. The context I've been through with you already. We're a low taxing authority, about 9.1% below the average. And a band B at the moment, which is our average, so we're an average band B. Whenever you hear anybody talking about it in the national press or government, everybody talks about band D. Actually, I don't even think the national average is band D either, but that is assumed to be the benchmark that is used. Anyway, Portsmouth average is band B, and the other piece of important context, I think, is that 58% of residents in Portsmouth pay the full council tax. That means 42% get some form of exemption or discount. So when we talk about council tax, it's important to recognise there are other things within the council tax system that make it a more means-tested tax, if you like, because there's the local council tax support scheme as well. In terms of the council tax proposal, I've mentioned the uplifts, but what that does in terms of pence per week for an average council taxpayer in Portsmouth, for the general part, so the 2.99% increase, that's 78 pence per week. Interestingly, if you converted it to band D, it's a pound exactly. It's £1 a week. And for the social care element of it, the 2%, obviously that's about 2/3, which is 52 pence per week for a band B taxpayer. But each 1% on the council tax raises just over £1 million, so it's 1,027,000. So if you were to say, for example, we don't think you should put the council tax up by 2.99%, put it up by 1.99%, that's another £1 million, just over £1 million worth of savings the council would have to find. Or if you said don't put the adult social care precept up by the 2%, that's £2.1 million worth of savings adult social care would have to find in order to forego that level of additional funding. And the other point about the tax is it's not just about how much you increase the tax, it's about how many people pay the tax. So the number of properties that pay the tax. We've got, in terms of Band D equivalents, I know we use Band D even though it's Band B as the average, there's just over 1,000 extra Band D equivalent properties paying council tax next year. Some of that, or a good chunk of that, relates to this is the first year of the introduction of the 100% premium on second homes. So it relates to that, and it relates to a reduction in our local council tax support caseload. They're the two things that are driving the increase in the equivalent number of properties that pay council tax. And what will the bill look like, the council tax bill? So that's at the bottom of the slide. You'll see PCC 4. If it goes through, obviously, as proposed. PCC 4.99% increase. Police and Crime Commissioner 5.35% increase. That's agreed now, I think. Fire and Rescue Authority 6.04% increase. I think that's oh no, they meet the same day as the council. I think they meet. Is it Wednesday? Can't remember, but I know that's the proposal. In overall terms, assuming all of those proposals go through, it's just over a 5% increase in council tax. So let's actually turn to the proposals themselves. So what is included within the budget proposal? So as I've mentioned, £2 million worth of budget savings proposals. That was originally planned to be £1 million when we did this exercise last year and we forecast forward. But Cabinet have been compelled to increase that saving by £1 million because of all of those pressures you've heard me talk about, in order to get to a position where, yes, they've got a balanced budget, but it's still an underlying deficit of 4.4 million. So it's to try to get on that pathway to a structurally balanced budget, not possible in 25-26, but is possible in 26-27, assuming 26-27 there's £3 million worth of savings made. But as you'll see, because of the increasing costs in adult social care, remember, rewind back into the current year, and housing, over £16 million worth of cost pressures. That's converting now into increasing adults and children's social care combined of 17.5 million. You can see the individual figures there, 8.2 and 9.3. Additional funding for temporary accommodation, 5.2. Other inflation I've mentioned, but we have got the offsetting savings against that of 2 million, and we've got the Treasury investments income as well offsetting that. In overall terms, given an £18.8 million uplift in the 8.5% that I mentioned. These numbers aren't intended to add. If anybody's going through adding up the numbers, they won't add up exactly because I'm just highlighting the key movements. And I've talked, this is the point where I get the opportunity to talk about social care and what I've described within the report as the social care gap. So you'll recall that if you look at the section above, the increase in spending on adults and children's social care, add the two figures up, the 8.2 and the 9.3, that's £17.5 million. Take away the government funding that I mentioned to you on the previous slide when we talked about the local government funding settlement, £5.2 million. Take away the £2 million or the £2.1 million that we're allowed to increase the council tax by for the adult social care precept. That leaves you with a gap of 10.2 million. So our costs compared to the funding that's been allowed, and that's not just government funding, that's the local taxpayer as well, contributing 2.1 million, the gap is still £10.2 million. And that's what's driving the council savings and the underlying budget deficit. So, whilst all that has been provided for within the budget for 25-26, I can't sit here and say to you, we've covered all of our bases and all risks are covered. Because the escalation in social care costs in the current year have been such that I couldn't, hand on heart, say that there won't be any further escalation of costs. There could be. Council has a contingency, which I'll come to, which is one of the reasons why it has a contingency, and one of the reasons it's going to be set at the level that it's planned to be set at. So there's general uncertainty, obviously, around adults and children's social care, particularly considering the increase in costs in the current year. There's general uncertainty around what we'll receive in business rates and council tax, because it depends on how much of it you collect. And it also depends, particularly in terms of business rates, whether there'll be lots of business rate appeals and whether those appeals will be successful. So there's a lot of assumptions and estimation that goes into our estimations around council tax and business rates. Equally, if we do the same thing on council tax, we have to say how many households will receive an exemption, how many will receive a discount, what will happen to local council tax support, how many people will be supported through that mechanism, and how much will we actually collect, what will the collection rate be. So there's obviously there's a fair amount of risk embedded within any estimate, and I'm not saying this is not a typical year. Those things will persist in every year. And so there's a reason why the council has a contingency which is so high at 22 million. It's to cover those potential costs around temporary accommodation, adult social care, children's social care. So we've provided for some of the risk in the contingency. So some of those figures that you're seeing up there, particularly the temporary accommodation figure, that's in the council's contingency. That's part of that 22 million. So that's the story of next year's budget proposal. If we then do what I often call the crystal ball gazing and take all of our assumptions, not just for 25-26, and say what are our assumptions for each of the next 3 years beyond 25-26, then you get my colour-coded circle chart. So anything in red is financially negative, a cost in one form or other. Anything in green is financially positive, or either a saving or additional funding or additional income. And the figure in the middle it's in amber because it's not certain. And I'll explain that as we go through. So inflation over 3 years, everything that we know about, what we think about pay inflation, what we think about consumer price index, what we think about interest rates, what we think about specific inflation for specific types of costs, all built into that number. And we anticipate it's about just over 15 million by the time we get to 28, 29. So for 26, 27, 27, 28, 28, 29, add all of that inflation together for the full 3 years, we think it's about 15.2 million. We take as our source, by the way, so it is informed estimation. So we use the intelligence of the Office of the Budget Responsibility, the government's forecaster, and we use their forecast to inform our own forecasts. Social care pressures, adults and children's, we think that might be, and over and above normal inflation, that is, over and above inflation, we think that, so if you like, growth in demand, that will be at least 13 million. And then there's a few other things across all other council services amounting to 1.4 million. If we then look at what's happening on the funding side, we anticipate our funding from government grants to rise by just 2 million. Now, obviously I've made the caveat, and I've got it on the right-hand side, we don't know what the outcome of the local government reform will be. Local government reform comprises 2 elements. I won't go into all of the detail. One is called the Fair Funding Review, the other is the business rate reset. Business rates, we anticipate increasing over the period by 4.1 million. Mainly the uplifts in, as I mentioned earlier, the uplift to the September CPI that is added to business rates each year. and a £14.5 million increase in council tax. And that is largely, so we are assuming council tax will rise by 4.99% each and every year up until the end of 28-29. So we're assuming the adult social care precept will prevail in each of those years as well. We don't make that assumption lightly, by the way, so that's the assumption that the Office for Budget Responsibility are also making, which is why it's built into our forecast. It's not speculative in that sense. It's got a foundation to it. Because of the uncertainty, I can't say it's definitely going to be a £9 million deficit, but I can say it might vary. 9 million could vary, plus or minus £6 million. On a good day, we'll be sat here in 12 months' time. We'll know what the outcome of the reform of local government funding looks like, and our funding will be more than I expected. At the moment, I'm expecting it's going to be broadly neutral on the council. So no loss, no gain. I think that's a reasonable assumption at this stage. I wouldn't want to say that the council is going to lose funding, particularly because I mentioned earlier on that the council received an allocation through the recovery grant. That's probably one of the best indications we've got around direction of travel in terms of government funding reform. It's not the only thing, but it's one of them. So it would probably be a bit overly cautious to assume a reduction in funding from government. Or it could be more. I mean, the pressures in adults and children's social care could be much greater than anticipated. And we may not fare very well in local government reform, who knows. So that's why it's plus or minus 0.6. The trick, of course, is to kind of plan for the middle ground. If you plan for the middle ground, then you've got the opportunity to change without, so you haven't gone too hard because you've planned for the middle ground, haven't gone too hard in the early days, or you haven't gone too shallow, so you've got the opportunity to respond. So that, of course, looks like if we spread that on an even basis over the period 26, 27, 27, 28, 28, 29, that's £3 million per year, and that's what I said to you right at the top of the presentation. But like I said, could vary by plus or minus 6, which on an annual basis over 3 years means plus or minus 2. So next year could be plus 3, or 26, 27 could be 3 million, it could be 5 million, or it could be 1 million.
Does the blue arrow mean anything as opposed to the grey arrows?
Sorry, on the previous slide. No, only that we didn't quite get the colour formatting right. It was a good swap. Somebody's paying attention. So anyway, so that deals with the revenue budget and the forecasts, and not too long to go now. I'm finishing up on the capital programme. So, capital programme. Clearly, we have a capital strategy, and you would expect us, as a responsible council, to say, if you've got a capital strategy, first and foremost, you must meet your statutory obligations. Whether that be health and safety or whether it be your statutory duties for your core services. So part of that obviously is to make sure that you've got continuation of those core services. So there will be things in this capital programme that are about enabling those services to be able to continue to deliver their work on a day-to-day basis. One thing that springs to mind, and I'll mention it when we get there, is to have a care-compliant adult social care management system. So that's just about making sure that you can continue to do the job properly in a way that satisfies your statutory responsibilities. Obviously, there's aims and objectives around the environment and also about regeneration and clean economic growth. And as I mentioned before, regeneration and economic growth in particular can help the council with its own financial sustainability, because it increases the funding base through business rates and council tax, and it also potentially reduces the demand. As prosperity rises, it reduces the demand on council services. So the resources available sounds big, and it is at 53.4 million, but a large chunk of that is borrowing. It's probably worth me mentioning that borrowing takes place within a within a regulatory code. It's called the Prudential Code, and it's a statutory code, so we've got to have regard to it. And it basically says that any borrowing that you undertake, one, it's got to be prudent, and two, you've got to be able to afford it. But you've got to be able to afford it on a long-term basis, not just for 1 year or 2 years. If you take out a loan for 50 years, you've got to be able to afford the repayments for 50 years. So it's about long-term sustainability. All the time a council's got forecast deficits, you can't demonstrate you can afford to borrow and repay borrowing unless, as a direct consequence of that expenditure, of that capital investment, you will make savings or generate income that can more than cover your borrowing costs. And that's the only way you can make the case for borrowing under the Prudential Code. Because we can't make the case that we've got plenty of money and we can afford to borrow 50 million quid because we've got, the council's got plenty of cash reserves and it can demonstrate that it can afford the borrowing costs of £50 million, which might be £4 million per annum, next year, the year after, the year after that, year after that, the year after that. We haven't got that because we've got a looming deficit. A looming deficit, the 9 million. What we might describe as the corporate resources, which is the money that you can basically, there's no real strings attached so long as it's legal and you've got a statutory duty or a statutory power. It's 16.3 million, and it mainly comes from community infrastructure levy or money that we've set aside from the revenue budget. It's a revenue contribution. You'll probably be aware that if we do, or when we have in the past, if we've ever underspent on the budget, we usually transfer that into a pot for the following year's capital programme. You would rather be in a position where you're budgeting to make a contribution from your revenue budget into your capital programme, because that's a planned way, and we know that we will always have capital needs. There's always capital investment required, even to keep statutory services running. And then there's some reserves and contributions that are funding the proposals as well, and they are either specific reserves that are held, or it might be the council's MTRS reserve, which is for spend to save schemes. So that 53.4 million translates into these major schemes. I'll start at the bottom just because it's the big number. So you've obviously heard me talk about temporary accommodation for a bit throughout this presentation, and what a drain it is now on the council's revenue account. Current year overspending by 5.9 million, expected to be 5.2 million additional cost in 25-26. There's a proposition within the budget report in the capital programme to acquire, purchase, build, or otherwise get hold of accommodation in order to use it for temporary accommodation, rather than placing our homeless in bed and breakfast or the private rented sector. Obviously there's obvious advantages to that, not just in terms of the standard of accommodation that you might be able to provide, but also the cost of that accommodation to the council. We've done the financial evaluation that suggests that if we were to acquire 200 properties over a period of time, 3 to 4 years, by the time we get to 28, 29, then we should be saving around about £6 million per annum compared to our current cost, which will pretty much eliminate that financial pressure that we're experiencing. Now that means we borrow for it, we acquire the properties, the rental income that we receive, and the savings that we make against bed and breakfast will give us a £6 million surplus compared to where we are right now. So that's after having paid the debt costs on. So you get your rental income. You obviously then have your costs associated with the property. You'll have some repairs and maintenance costs. We factor that in. You'll have some borrowing costs. We factor that in. We'll have then a surplus that is then available to fund the debt costs. And with the temporary accommodation savings on top, it's an overall £6 million surplus on an annual basis by the time you get a few years down the track. Some of the other larger items on here, I'll start at the top mainly. Landlord's maintenance. This is the landlord's maintenance obligations. This is in part because we have a large property estate. So the council is good at collecting buildings and keeping buildings, but the consequence of holding and keeping buildings is that they have to be maintained, and it is now a heavy drain on the council's revenue budget and the council's capital programme. It's a drain on the revenue budget in terms of energy costs, it's a drain in terms of day-to-day maintenance costs, and it's a drain in terms of the capital maintenance costs as well, whether it be boilers, roofs, windows, you name it. And it's now costing us £2.4 million a year just to keep them health and safety compliant and nothing else. This is the stuff that is anticipated to fail within the next 12 months, that if it does, could result in the closure of a building. There's no level of embellishment beyond that. There is a piece of work in train which is a proper asset management strategy piece of work. So there's a lot of surveying being undertaken at the moment across the property estate, properly understand condition, the performance of the asset as well in terms of its energy performance, for example, but also whether it's fit for purpose. Does it actually meet the needs of what it is the council is providing? So I can't stress enough, it's not a great idea to get attached. I know we get attached to council as an affinity with properties, but it's hampering the council's ability to deliver services. Can't stress that enough. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So much of the rest in here is a lot of the capital programme is actually just about maintaining services. There's not a great deal of embellishment. A lot of it is about making sure we're health and safety compliant, or we're statutory duty compliant, or we're passporting funding. So when we get to areas like school places and schools maintenance, that's pretty much money we've received from government, that grants that we're passporting over. So 2.5 million of that 2.4 million of that 3.9, for example, is money we've received in the current year, which was basically around SEND and school places. The other 1.5 million relates to schools maintenance. So DFE pay it over to us. They expect us to spend it on mending the leaky roofs and the replacement boilers for the local authority maintained schools, that is, and we passport it straight to the service, and they've got their own prioritisation through a proper asset management plan process. Similarly, the transport, that is about passporting the money that the DFT pay over to the council. It looks like a big number, but it's because that's 2 years worth of funding, so that they've got an overall 3-year rolling programme now. So they can look ahead 3 years and plan for 3 years. Ditto for the schools, so they can look ahead 3 years and plan for 3 years. Social care management system I mentioned earlier on, the other figures are less significant. I do want to mention this. This is this relates to what I said before. Really, is that we're all the council's aspirations and needs in terms of capital investment will always exceed the resources available, and there's always going to be a capital gap. So part of the way to address that is that in the future we ought to be building an element within the revenue budget to make a contribution to the capital programme. Always applying for external funding will always be part of that solution, but there will be certain types of capital expenditure that you will never get external funding for, like our landlord maintenance, the maintenance of our own properties, or the new adult social care system that we mentioned earlier on, or a lot of the day-to-day investment around our leisure facilities, for example. You're not always going to get funding for those types of things, so there'll always be a gap, and it means that we ought to plan for that. And just finally, I don't think I'm going to go over any of this because I've laboured it, but I think the one thing that I would like to do is just touch on the final bullet point on this slide here. So the budget is incredibly challenged, but this council has acted responsibly in the past in terms of that's all parties. So I'm not being partisan here, but all administrations have acted responsibly in the past, and that's led the council to a position where it's never spent beyond its means. It's always been broadly in line with the savings it needed to make. It hasn't done things of a one-off nature just to balance the books. So that means that we come from a position where the council's position is generally sound, but our savings in the future are likely to be higher than we've experienced in the recent past. But we've got a reasonable basis, we're reasonably resilient, and because we're reasonably resilient, for example, we've been able to accommodate the massive increase in costs we had this year. But you can see that massive increase in costs this year has now turned us into a structural deficit for next year. So whilst our base position is good, the future is starting to get challenged. This is my favourite slide of the deck. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Chris. We'll take questions from the floor. Anybody got any questions? Graham?
First of all, thank you, Chris, for that very comprehensive run through the budget. A lot of detail there, but the nice thing about it is when you hear it more than once, you get to embed what's actually there because there's so much detail. So thank you very much for taking the time to do that. I wanted to ask a question about the capital spend on housing. When we made a recent acquisition of housing association properties, that went into the housing revenue account as the asset. The general fund covers homelessness costs. So is the acquisition of properties going to sit within the general fund and be maintained through that, or is it going to be maintained through the housing revenue account?
It will be maintained through the housing revenue account. So these will be housing revenue account acquisitions. and you're right, homelessness cost is a general fund cost, but the rents will be received obviously in the housing revenue account. The costs of maintaining the properties will be in the housing revenue account, and there'll be a charge to the general fund for any of the accommodation themselves. So there's no cross subsidy between the two, but in any event, the general fund is only able to hold 200 properties as a maximum before you have to establish a housing revenue account anyway, so you can't go beyond 200 within the general fund.
The reason for my question was I wasn't sure whether we were creating a separate sort of entity. Am I allowed to ask another question, or somebody else wants to? It goes to the issue about the fair funding review. I want to get a bit of clarification. I think we're glad to see the fair funding review being reinstated after 8 years of nothing much happening. But I was reading in your report about the way it's being set up on the principles. You talked about the consultation on the principles, and in paragraph 8.20, you talk about the way in which the fair funding review will look at previous council tax policy. And I think you basically say that if local authorities have foregone the opportunity to raise council tax, that could have an impact on how our funding is affected. Now, I think you're referring to at least a couple of occasions where in the past, the previous government offered the council a sum of money in 1 year and said, don't increase council tax and you'll give you this money. But it didn't continue into the next year. So it dropped out. So we were back to the position we were in the previous year. But we lost out on raising council tax. Therefore, it wasn't in the base budget. Therefore, our council tax was being raised on like 2 years ago. And that's how I understand it. Given that that was done by a previous government, is the principle of that operating still within the remit of what they're planning to do, or is there some opportunity to say to the government, actually, that was previous governments telling you not to do it, and it doesn't seem fair to say, well, we did what we were asked to do, and can we get around that, I suppose is the best way to put it, or is this a question you can't really answer, that it's still being consulted on?
Councillor Heaney, that's the longest question in the universe.
It is a good question, and it will be part of the consultation. So, broadly speaking, what they do is they say there's an average level of council tax across the country, and this is what it is. And we'll assume that's what your council tax is for the purposes of doing a formula allocation. They're not going to say, you tax that council tax is that amount, that council tax is that amount, that council tax is that amount. We'll assume that's what your count, you know. There won't be a bespoke arrangement for every single council. There'll be an assumption, which is how the current methodology works, of the average level of council tax, and that's what you tax for. And the underpinning principle of that is you have exercised your local discretion in setting the council tax. You have made that decision. It's not government that has made it for you. And as a consequence of your decision, you have chosen to keep your council tax low for your residents and forego the services that you could otherwise have provided. It's not for government to fix that position. I think it's probably their starting point. I'm not entirely sure whether the Portsmouth is lower than the average as a consequence of those council tax freezes. I think it will depend. I can't remember when those council tax freezes were now exactly, but this latest, that the formula that the funding regime we're working within at the moment was reset in 2013-14. So it will be whatever the position was at that point. If the freezes were before that, it probably there probably is a legacy. But equally, if the council have chosen not to increase council tax in previous years or kept it below what's happening in the national average, it hurts the council in terms of its overall funding. But the council have taken that decision consciously. So government effectively say, that's your local decision-making power, and that's local democracy.
Thank you. Councillor Dare?
Yeah, clearly all authorities are under great pressure to build. I wonder, is this saying build, baby, build? But clearly we're under great pressure to build a lot of houses. Planning last week, 58 houses were given permission on the St James's site. We've got Debenhams coming on site, and clearly at the moment, Tipner West, Tipner East are just big muddy fields. There's obviously going to be a lot of income coming in from rates. Are we able to, at this stage to factor in the extra money we'll be getting from the rates when these places come online?
What we tend to do in our forecast, some of those will come online in future years, so what we tend to do in our forecasts is we say to ourselves, what is the general change in, that affects what we call our tax base, which, as I mentioned earlier on, is the number of bandy equivalent number of properties. So, but it's not the only thing that impacts our tax base, obviously. So we factor in any historic growth and assume that the trend will broadly be the same. If it ends up being better, then obviously our forecasts are on the upside. If it ends up being worse, our forecasts are on the downside. So we don't specifically say what's in the planning system, for example, because equally we'd have to say, and what do we think is going to happen to discounts? What's going to happen to exemptions? What's going to happen to the local council tax support scheme and so forth? They all also have an impact on our overall council tax base. So we look at historic trends in aggregate rather than looking at individual elements of the whole council tax income calculation.
Hunt, as an observer, do you get to ask questions?
No, I don't, but with your permission, I just wondered, I want to pick up a point that Councillor Heaney said, Chair. Would that be all right? Is that all right? I wanted to understand his point better. Is that all right? I wondered if what Councillor Heaney was saying was if we had forgone those one-offs and allowed the council tax to rise more than the one-offs, which would have probably have happened, the structural deficit would have been reduced or not there at all. Was that what he was getting at?
That wasn't quite what I was getting at, no.
I can answer that, Councillor Hunt. I think.
Would it be the case?
Well, yeah, let me answer that. Can I answer both questions? So I think what Councillor Heaney was getting at was that, is there an opportunity to go to government to say, as a consequence of previous decisions to freeze the council tax, our council tax is lower than it should be. Please, can we be recompensed for that in terms of future government funding? I think the answer to that is we can ask the question. I think the government starting point is that was your decision. You made that decision consciously and forwent council services as a consequence. However, if the council had taxed at the average of our statistical neighbours, the council would have an extra £10.1 million worth of council tax, and the council would have no structural deficit next year.
Any more questions, folks?
Thank you. And I think we need to say a big thank you to our Section 151 officer, because you always do an outstanding job for us, or as best a job you can in the circumstances. There's just two things that I've just wondered. One of them I don't know. Well, I'll ask in a moment anyway. The first one is recently we knew that there was a lot of housing that wasn't up to standard. So how much of the budget have we had to allocate to, because we weren't rated very good, were we, for some of our housing accommodation? Has that had quite an impact on this budget?
Yeah, that's in the, it is in this budget actually, in the sense that it's in the capital programme. So within the capital programme itself, trying to remember what appendix it is. But it's the housing revenue element of it, but it's the housing revenue accounts capital programme, which is part of what we'll be asked to approve here. So it will be in Appendix E, but you'll probably notice an uplift in the maintenance elements of housing in there. If you spoke to housing, I mean they are also doing their own asset management strategy for the whole of the housing portfolio, and would like to shift to a position where they've got their housing up to a certain standard so that they can spend less on maintenance and more on renewal and acquisition, and a base level on maintenance. But there is an uplift in their repairs, not just as a consequence of the recent inspection, which I think most things were already in hand anyway, but as a consequence of the needs of the stock generally. So it is reflected in Appendix E. I'd have to find the exact line. If I can look.
And would that mean that the work would then be completed quickly to put the houses that are of concern, or housing that is of concern, like correcting it within this year if it is sort of failing?
On the whole, yes, it should. And I think most of those plans are already in place. So I don't think there's necessary a worry on that. And I think some of the standards that the regulator has judged us by are not the legal standards. They're higher than the legal standards, but they're kind of standards that the council has set itself. So I think that there's an example. I'll get it wrong. It might be the fire safety standards. I think it is, where I think the legal standard is there's a figure of 10%, but we measure ourselves against a 5% threshold, for example. And that's what I think the regulator's done.
Thank you. Can I just ask one more question? Sorry. It was just around, and I know because the budget, you've got the forecast for sort of 28, 29. I don't know if it's sort of, I don't really know how you can preempt, but around this devolution proposal, how would that have an impact? Because as a council, we've heard you say that we are in a good position. We should have a balanced budget. We have, our reserves, which is there. So against other councils, if they're not in such a good position, how is that going to work? Because that could happen within 2 years, as we're on the priority plan now. I can't get my head around it. So I'm sorry if it's not the right question to ask now, but because we're talking budgets and you're planning for 28, 29, but we could be a completely different authority by then. So how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, of course you're right. There's, obviously there's the devolution aspect and there's the local government reorganisation aspect to it as well. So devolution may come ahead of local government reorganisation, or likely to come ahead of local government reorganisation, which means the devolution of powers to a strategic authority. So this is not powers ceding up, it's powers coming down from government, and then a strategic authority will oversee them. And we could be a beneficiary of that in any event, because that should come with a pot of money that is shared out around the area, but the decision's made by the strategic authority. So there's a kind of plus on that side. And then there's, well, actually, in order to, in terms of the white paper, be able to function effectively as a strategic authority, you need to have broadly equal size partners within that strategic authority. So that would potentially be the Hampshire, the Portsmouth area, the Southampton area, and let's say the Isle of Wight area. So there could be local government reorganisation to come to a greater Portsmouth, if you like, example, or a greater Southampton. At this stage, what that will mean conceptually is, let's just say that instead of being a single authority as Portsmouth Unitary, there's a larger new established entity authority made up of its constituent parts. So for planning purposes now, we'll assume our constituent part remains the same. And then when the new authority is established, those elements come in as well. They will all be doing their financial planning, and if everything was perfect, you just add them all up, and they all fit nice and neatly together. Of course, we've got the fly in the ointment, haven't we, which is, but next year there's going to be local government funding reform. So that's all going to change. So there is an element of uncertainty, obviously, but all that we can do at this stage is plan as our individual authorities and assume that when we come together, we will just aggregate it up. So if we're all planning responsibly, and we're all, exactly, if we're all being financially responsible, you would expect one authority, for example, what might now be 4 individual authorities planning responsibly come together to become an amalgamated single authority that has planned responsibly. That's an ideal situation, but I think it's the only way that we can approach it from a financial planning perspective at this stage. And we shouldn't be, not to plan is the wrong thing. You know, we've got to plan for something, and we've got to plan on the best information that we have at the time and do it in a responsible fashion.
Thank you, Chris. Councillor Kadir?
Okay, thank you. Not quite sure is the question. No, we have this police and crime commissioner, £14 and £5. I just need a bit more clarity. What's this figure and how much is it we're talking about? Because if we are, because Hannah's question was, if we are moving into a different, bigger organization, do we need to do this time as we are in a financial crisis?
This council doesn't have any jurisdiction over the increase for the Hampshire Police and Crime Commissioner or the Hampshire Fire and Rescue Authority. They are their own entities. We're just the billing authority, so we're just the organisation that sends out the bill, collects the money on their behalf, and then pays it over to them. So there's no, there is no decision-making ability of this council in relation to those elements of the increase.
And am I right in saying that when we have a Lord Mayor, we won't have a crime commissioner anymore, or it'll be subsumed? Elected mayor.
Correct, that's right. And then it will be the strategic authority that is effectively making decisions on the council tax elements for fire and police, rather than there won't be a Hampshire Police and Crime Commissioner, and there won't be a Hampshire Fire and Rescue Authority. There'll be a strategic authority.
Any more questions, folks? No? Are there any of those questions that you feel that we need to take forward to the Cabinet? Or are you happy with the answer you've had today? Councillor?
Can I just make a comment? I mean, whilst in theory, the Scrutiny Management Panel has an opportunity to comment on the budget, I mean, in practice, it's quite difficult to do because when we aren't involved in the budget process as a Scrutiny Management Panel. We only get to see a presentation before the Cabinet has more or less made its decisions. And also, there isn't a collaborative process for dealing with the budget, although theoretically there could be. We have discussed this before about whether there could be or should be, but it has never been actioned on. So actually, I don't think there's any practical recommendations we could necessarily make in any detail on the budget from our perspective, at least from my perspective. And although I've had an opportunity to read the papers, otherwise I think there are other ways in which we do that through our various group discussions. I mean, whether we want to change that in the future is another matter, but I don't think there's been any appetite to change that from the administration, and so unless they prepare to do that, Scrutiny Management can't really have much of a role in preparing the budget or doing it in a collaborative fashion unless that changes. So.
in which case I'm going to draw the meeting to a close. Thank you. We conclude the meeting and declare the meeting closed at 6:30, I believe.